Welcome to my channel. Today we are going to explore the dramatic and intense story of William Sterling, a man who built his empire from the ground up, achieving extraordinary success and power. However, everything begins to unravel when he receives a mysterious letter from a stranger named Marcus, who claims that William is being betrayed by those closest to him. Let's follow this story together to see what William will do when faced with dark secrets in his family and company, where everything he thought was solid suddenly crumbles. Will he rise again and rebuild from scratch? Let this story take you on an unforgettable emotional journey. So, what do you think of William Sterling's journey? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on more fascinating stories. William Sterling sat in his sleek office, the floor-to-ceiling glass walls offering a panoramic view of the city below. The sun had begun to dip, casting an amber glow over the sprawling streets and the skyscrapers that dotted the skyline. He leaned back in his leather chair, eyes scanning the scene as he took a moment to appreciate the power he held. The power that this very view, this immaculate office, symbolized. Success. That was what William Sterling had built from the ground up. His empire was flourishing, his name revered, and his control over the business world was unshakable. Yet, despite all the admiration, there was a gnawing feeling of unease that had been creeping up on him for days. He couldn't shake it, no matter how many cigars he smoked or how many business deals he sealed. A single envelope on his desk snapped him out of his thoughts. It was an odd one, plain, unassuming, but strangely foreboding. There was no return address, and the handwriting that adorned the front was jagged, almost desperate. William frowned as his fingers hovered over it. It wasn't typical for someone of his stature to receive unsolicited letters. In his world, people wrote emails, made phone calls, or sent their personal assistants to deliver messages. This felt wrong, but curiosity gnawed at him, compelling him to tear the envelope open. Inside, there was a single sheet of paper, its edges slightly frayed as if it had been handled far too many times. William unfolded it and read the message. Mr. Sterling, you don't know me, but I know everything about you. I know what's happening in your company. Someone close to you is betraying you, and the damage will be bigger than you can imagine. It's already in motion. William's eyes narrowed as he read it over again. A bitter laugh escaped his lips. Was this some kind of joke? How could someone close to him, no less, betray him? He was the boss, the leader, the one who controlled every thread of his empire. There was no room for betrayal in his world. The idea was absurd. The letter didn't even come close to making sense. He set the paper down on his desk, a skeptical smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Marcus, he muttered to himself. It sounded like a name ripped from a cheap thriller novel, something a low-level criminal might use to intimidate a high-powered CEO. William's fingers brushed across the glossy surface of his desk, eyes briefly glancing over the top of the letter again. The handwriting wasn't neat, but it wasn't completely illegible either. It was as though the person writing it had been rushed, or perhaps a little desperate. Yet the words were too specific, too deliberate to ignore entirely. He tossed the paper aside, already dismissing it as a prank. He had a busy schedule, and things like this, unprovoked letters from nameless individuals, were nothing more than distractions, but the gnawing feeling in his gut grew louder. How could a child, let alone someone poor and black, know anything about my high-end corporate world? He muttered to himself, the words dripping with disdain. It wasn't the first time he had used such a dismissive tone when referring to people outside of his social circle. The idea of someone with such humble beginnings having any understanding of his business dealings was laughable. He chuckled darkly, leaning back in his chair once more. For a moment, he considered just throwing the letter in the trash. It would have been so easy, so simple. But the more he thought about it, the more the words seemed to fester in his mind. There was something about it that felt different, something that nagged at him in a way he couldn't quite explain. It was like a faint echo of a warning bell he couldn't fully hear. He shook his head and stood up, walking toward the massive windows. His reflection stared back at him in the glass, a man who had everything he could possibly want: a successful career, a luxurious home, an impeccable reputation. He had worked his entire life to get to this point, and he wasn't about to let some anonymous letter shake him. But as his gaze lingered on the horizon, something inside him, something deep and primal, whispered that this wasn't just a silly distraction. There was something serious behind those words, something more than just an empty threat. With a resigned sigh, he reached for the letter again. He studied it for a moment longer, turning it over in his hands. Something in the back of his mind urged him to dig deeper. Maybe it was because he had seen firsthand how ruthless people could be, how even the smallest detail could turn into something dangerous. His phone buzzed on the desk, interrupting his thoughts. William's eyes flicked to the screen, but he didn't immediately answer. He stood there, staring at the skyline once more, the weight of the letter still hanging in the air like a dark cloud. A sense of foreboding settled into his bones, but he couldn't quite put his finger on why. "Who is Marcus?" he whispered to himself. It was a name he didn't recognize, and it bothered him. More than the letter itself, more than the vague threat, it was the uncertainty that troubled him. Who was this person, and what did they want? How did they know about his company, his business, his inner circle? The feeling of unease was no longer just a fleeting thought. It had taken root in his mind, gnawing at him like a parasite. William paced around the room, his mind racing through every possible scenario. There was no telling who could be behind it or what kind of damage they might be capable of. His mind snapped back to the letter as if it had a life of its own. Someone close to you is betraying you. William's heart skipped a beat. There it was again, betrayal. He could feel the weight of those words pressing down on him. Betrayal wasn't just a business term. It was personal. It was a wound, one that cut deeper than any financial loss. He suddenly felt the weight of every decision, every relationship, every handshake he had made in the past few months. Was there someone close to him, who had been playing him all along? With a sigh, William reached for his phone and dialed his most trusted assistant, Julia. "I need you to dig up everything you can on a man named Marcus," he said, his voice suddenly tinged with urgency. The letter had shaken him more than he cared to admit, and as the phone call ended, he realized something deep down. He wasn't laughing anymore. The game was just beginning. The days that followed were a whirlwind of unsettling developments, each one more unnerving than the last. It all began innocuously enough, with a few small cracks appearing in the otherwise pristine exterior of William Sterling's empire. But these cracks quickly grew into gaping chasms that threatened to swallow everything he had worked so tirelessly to build. The first sign came with the stock market. It had always been a reliable barometer for William's success, an ever-present reflection of his power and influence. But one morning, the figures on his screen told a different story. The numbers were plunging, a sharp, downward trend that seemed to come out of nowhere. Stocks that had been steady for months, even years, were plummeting in a chaotic dance. Investors were frantically calling, demanding answers, but all William had was confusion. How could this happen? He thought. What's going on? He'd run the numbers 1,000 times. There was no logical reason for this drop. His analysts had been thorough, and the company was in good standing. Until now. The warning from the mysterious letter echoed in his mind. The damage will be bigger than you can imagine. Then the leaks started. Confidential documents, blueprints for upcoming murders, private financial details, internal communications began appearing on the dark web. They were precise, detailed, and timed with a purpose. No one on his team could explain how this had happened, and the more they investigated, the more it seemed as though the leaks were coming from the very heart of his company. Trust, once a given in the Sterling Corporation, was starting to crumble. By the time William turned his attention to the next piece of the puzzle, the situation had escalated even further. One of his most trusted executives, a man named Raymond Foster, was caught embezzling millions of dollars from the company. It was a betrayal that shook William to his core. Raymond had been with him for over a decade, a loyal ally, or so he had thought. The news of Raymond's actions spread quickly, and with it came a wave of distrust and panic among the rest of the executive team. And that's when the thought hit William like a slap in the face. Could it be? The letter, the warnings. It was all happening exactly as it had been predicted. Someone close to him was betraying him, and the consequences were unfolding right before his eyes. Lily, he called to his assistant, his voice tinged with both frustration and disbelief. You've seen it, right? All of these things happening exactly as the letter said. Lily, who had been pacing nervously by the door, hesitated before speaking, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, sir, she began, her eyes darting around as if she could see the walls closing in on her. But everything's going wrong at once. The investors are starting to ask questions. We need to act fast. William slammed his fist onto his desk, the force of the action echoing in the otherwise silent office. He could feel the pressure building, suffocating him. It's impossible. This can't be happening. How could a child know about all of this? His voice broke, a hint of panic creeping in despite his usually composed demeanor. Lily was silent for a long moment, clearly unsure how to proceed. The fear in her eyes mirrored William's own growing unease. The situation had escalated beyond anything they could have imagined, and there was no way to stop it. William took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. We need answers, he said finally, his tone steely with determination. Find out who's behind this, Lily. We can't afford to wait any longer. But even as he gave the orders, a gnawing feeling settled in his stomach. He had no idea how to go about solving this. He had always been in control, always one step ahead of the game. But now, it felt as though the rug was being pulled out from under him, and he couldn't find his footing. Hours passed. The weight of the day was beginning to bear down on William. He sat in his office, staring at the glowing screens in front of him, trying to make sense of the madness. Just as he was beginning to think he had no answers, the phone rang. It was an unknown number. His heart skipped a beat as he picked it up. Hello? William's voice was sharp, betraying none of the anxiety building within him. The voice on the other end was low, distorted. You have no idea who's behind this, the caller said, a note of amusement or perhaps something darker. It was not just one person. The corruption goes back decades. Trust no one. William's pulse quickened. His eyes narrowed, his grip tightening around the phone. Who is this? Who are you? He demanded, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. But the caller was already gone. The line went dead, leaving nothing but the faint buzzing of the empty connection in William's ear. His mind raced, his thoughts spinning out of control. The caller's words replayed over and over in his head. Corruption goes back decades. Trust no one. What did it mean? Who could be behind all of this? And how deep did the corruption run? Was it possible that the betrayal ran far deeper than just Raymond Foster? The realization hit William like a ton of bricks. He had no idea who he could trust anymore. His inner circle, the people he had relied on for years, had turned against him, and now the corruption had infiltrated everything, spreading like a cancer through the very foundation of the Sterling Corporation. As he sat back in his chair, staring at the phone in his hand, a chilling thought crossed his mind. What if the person who had sent the letter had been right? What if it was already too late to stop the damage? He didn't have the answers, but one thing was certain: he was no longer in control. The world he had built, the empire that had seemed so unshakable, was crumbling, and William Sterling was at the center of it all, watching helplessly as the storm closed in around him. The weight of everything William Sterling had built seemed to collapse around him as the days passed. His empire, which had once stood like a pillar of success and control, was crumbling under the weight of corruption, betrayal, and lies. The stock market plunges, the leaks of confidential information, and the embezzlement of funds, it was all happening so quickly, like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. But now it was time for answers. Driven by the gnawing questions that had kept him up at night, William followed every lead from the mysterious letter, each one leading him further into the unknown. He didn't care about the risks anymore. All that mattered was finding the truth. The deeper he dug, the more he felt like he was unraveling the threads of his life, pulling at the fabric of everything he'd ever known. It wasn't until a few days later that he found the first real clue: the name Marcus. It was the key that could unravel it all, the key to understanding how someone so small, so seemingly insignificant, could have known everything about his life, his company, his family. And so William set out, determined to find Marcus no matter where he was. The streets he walked were unfamiliar to him, far from the polished, controlled world he knew. It was a part of town he would never have visited willingly, a neighborhood that felt like it had been abandoned by time itself. The buildings were dilapidated, the sidewalks cracked, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. It was a stark contrast to the pristine office towers he was used to, the opulent houses, the world of wealth and power that had defined him for so long. But there, on a cracked sidewalk near a rundown apartment complex, William found him. Marcus! The boy was no older than 10, yet his eyes held a wisdom that was far beyond his years. His clothes were worn and faded, his shoes scuffed and barely held together, but it was the look in his eyes that sent a chill down William's spine. There was something unnerving about the calmness in his gaze, something unsettling about how much the boy seemed to know. William stood a few feet away, staring at him, unsure of what to do next. The boy didn't seem startled by his presence, nor did he show any signs of fear. Instead, he simply looked up at William, his expression unreadable. "Marcus?" William called, his voice tinged with caution. "Are you Marcus?" The boy didn't respond immediately. He merely tilted his head slightly, as if considering William's question. Then, with a small, almost knowing smile, he replied, "I knew you'd come. I had a feeling." The word sent a shiver down William's spine. How could he have known, he thought, taking a cautious step closer to the boy. Who is this child? William knelt down to meet Marcus's gaze, his frustration growing. "You wrote me a letter?" he said, his voice demanding answers. "How did you know all of this? How could you know about my company, about everything that's been happening?" Marcus simply shrugged, unfazed by the question. "I told you," he said coolly, his voice almost too calm for someone so young. "I know because I see things, the future, things that happen before they happen." William scoffed, his disbelief evident. "A psychic child?" he muttered, shaking his head. "This is ridiculous. You're just playing me, aren't you?" But Marcus didn't flinch at the accusation. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his expression growing more serious, more intense. "You don't get it," he said, his voice firm. "You don't see the bigger picture. It's not just your company, Mr. Sterling, it's your family. The fraud that started with your great-grandfather, it's in your bloodline." The words hit William like a punch to the stomach. He blinked, unable to process what he had just heard. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice shaky. "My family has worked hard. We built everything from nothing." But Marcus's eyes didn't waver. His voice remained cold, his words cutting through the air like a knife. "Your great-grandfather started it all," Marcus said, his voice gaining strength. "And now it's your turn to fall. But it doesn't have to end this way. I'm here to stop it." William's mind raced. How could this be true? The idea that his family, the very foundation of everything he had built, was built on fraud seemed impossible. He had spent his whole life building an empire of success and legitimacy. His great-grandfather had been a visionary, a man who had brought the family from nothing to something, using nothing but his wits and hard work. But now, as Marcus spoke, the world William had known began to crumble. What if he was right? What if the very foundation of his empire was built on lies? His thoughts were interrupted by Marcus, who leaned in closer, his eyes locked on William's. "You think you're in control, Mr. Sterling," Marcus said, his voice dark and intense. "But you're just a puppet. They've been using you, and now it's your turn to carry the lie. Do you want to be remembered for that?" William's face drained of color, his hands trembling as he struggled to grasp the magnitude of what Marcus was saying. I didn't know," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I couldn't have known. But how did you know this? How did you learn all of this?" Marcus's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "Because I see the truth, Mr. Sterling," he said, his voice calm and unwavering. "I see the things hidden in the dark corners where you can't reach. I'm the only one who can stop it." For a moment, William could only stand there, staring at Marcus, his mind spinning, unable to process the weight of the revelations that had just been thrust upon him. His world, the life he had built, everything he had ever known. It was all based on a lie that had been passed down through generations, hidden beneath a veneer of success and power. And now, it was all coming to light. As Marcus's words echoed in his ears, William felt a chill wash over him. The truth was out there, and he couldn't hide from it anymore. But could he fix it? Could he undo the damage that had been done, or was it too late? "How do I stop it?" William asked, his voice barely above a whisper, his fear palpable. Marcus stood up slowly, his small figure casting a long shadow in the fading light. "The only way to stop it is to expose the truth," he said, his voice steady. "The world needs to know what's really been happening behind closed doors. And you need to decide, Mr. Sterling. Will you continue to be part of the lie, or will you choose to do what's right?" For the first time in his life, William Sterling didn't have an answer. The ride to his uncle's house was one of the longest trips William had ever taken. The smooth hum of the car's engine did little to quell the growing turbulence inside him. Every word Marcus had spoken echoed in his mind, and every moment of his life seemed to have been placed under a harsh new light. How much of what he'd built was based on lies? What kind of man had his great-grandfather been? Was it all just a house of cards ready to collapse? The weight of the revelation was heavy, and William couldn't help but feel betrayed, not just by the people in his company, but by his very own bloodline. His mind raced with questions, all of which led him to one person: his Uncle George. George had been a fixture in the Sterling Corporation for as long as William could remember, a guiding hand in the company's day-to-day operations. George was the one who had always reassured William that everything would be fine, that the family legacy would continue. Now, all that seemed to hang in the balance. The Sterling estate loomed before him as he pulled up the long driveway. The house was just as grand and imposing as it had always been, a fortress of wealth and history. But for William, it no longer felt like a safe haven. The walls were closing in on him. He parked the car and walked toward the front door, his every step heavy with the knowledge of what was coming. Uncle George was sitting in his study when William entered, the old man's familiar silhouette outlined by the soft golden glow of a desk lamp. It was a comfortable scene, one that William had seen 1,000 times before, but now it felt like a scene from a different life, a time before everything had changed. Uncle George," William's voice cracked as he spoke, trying to keep his composure. "We need to talk." George looked up from his papers, a frown crossing his face as he saw the look in William's eyes. "What's going on, Billy?" he asked, a casual tone laced with concern. He knew his nephew well enough to see that something was off, but William wasn't in the mood for small talk. "Don't play dumb," William said, his voice hardening. "I know everything. The letter, Marcus, the fraud, all of it. What I need from you is the truth." George's face tightened. He leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing, as though trying to measure the gravity of the situation. The silence stretched for a moment, before he sighed deeply. "I didn't want this for you, William," he said quietly, "but it's time for you to know the whole truth." William stood there, fists clenched at his sides, barely able to control his emotions. "How deep does it go, Uncle? Tell me everything. Did my great-grandfather really start all of this with a lie?" George looked away, his expression pained. His hands trembled slightly as he steepled his fingers in front of him, as though bracing for the inevitable fallout. "Yes," he said finally, his voice tinged with regret. "Your great-grandfather was ruthless. He did what he had to do to build this empire. He used lies, blackmail, manipulation, whatever it took. And we continued it. We kept it going because that's all we knew." William's heart pounded in his chest. The anger he had been holding in for days bubbled to the surface, threatening to consume him. "And you let it happen?" he shouted, stepping forward, his voice rising. "You let my legacy, my name, be built on corruption, on deceit? Do you realize what you've done? Do you have any idea how much damage you've caused?" George looked up at him then, his face sagging with the weight of his confession. He didn't flinch from William's fury. Instead, he met his nephew's eyes with a deep sense of regret, almost as though he was already mourning the death of the empire they had worked so hard to build. "I'm not proud of it," George said softly. "But you have to understand, William, when your great-grandfather started this, it was a different world. We didn't have the luxury of playing by the rules. We did what we had to do to survive." William's fists clenched tighter, his knuckles turning white. The rage inside him swirled like a storm, but somewhere, deep down, there was a small flicker of understanding. "And now?" he demanded. "What happens now? Is everything we've done, all the work I've put into this company, is it all for nothing?" George paused for a moment, his eyes dropping to the desk in front of him. "I wish I could say we could undo it all, Billy, but we can't. What's done is done. The rot goes deep. But maybe it doesn't have to end this way." William's breath caught in his throat. What are you talking about? What do you mean?" George took a deep breath, his expression hardening with a new resolve. "There's one person who can stop it all, William. The one person who knows the truth and can break the cycle." "Marcus," William said quietly, his voice suddenly small. The name felt like a weight in his mouth. The child who had shattered everything he thought he knew about his family and his legacy. George nodded, his eyes never leaving William's. "Yes, Marcus is the key. He sees things, William, things that none of us can. He can stop the lies from destroying everything, but only if we let him. William felt a wave of disbelief wash over him. A child? You're telling me a child has the power to stop this? George sighed, rubbing his temples. It's not about his age, Billy. It's about what he knows, and the fact that he's the only one who can expose the truth we've hidden for generations. William staggered back, feeling the weight of it all pressing down on him. The betrayal, the lies, the empire built on secrets and manipulation, and now, it seemed, the only hope for redemption lay in the hands of a boy who saw the world in ways no one else could. "What do I do?" William asked, his voice shaking. George looked up at him, his gaze steady despite the sorrow in his eyes. "You have to make a choice, Billy. You can continue to live in the shadows of your family's lies, or you can step into the light. You can help Marcus expose everything, and you can try to rebuild what's left. It's not going to be easy, but it's the only way." For the first time in years, William felt the weight of his choices pressing down on him. The company he had spent his life building, the legacy of his family, it was all on the line. And the only way forward was to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. "Will it even matter?" William asked, his voice barely a whisper. George didn't answer right away. Instead, he simply looked at William, as though weighing the gravity of his nephew's question. After a long pause, he said quietly, "Maybe, but it's the only chance you've got." The day William Sterling chose to confront the truth was a day that would forever alter the course of his life, his family's legacy, and the empire he had spent decades building. The weight of his decision pressed heavily on his shoulders as he prepared to address the press, the world, and his own conscience. It was a moment that required courage, not just to admit the darkness within, but to offer a path forward, a glimmer of hope that something good could come from the wreckage. As he stepped into the spotlight, the flashes of cameras and the murmur of reporters filled the air. William had faced many high-stakes situations in his life, business deals, corporate negotiations, and moments of pressure that seemed insurmountable, but nothing compared to the weight of what he was about to say. Behind him, the towering buildings of his corporation stood tall, their glass facades gleaming in the sunlight. Yet, to William, they no longer symbolized success. They felt like a reminder of everything that had been built on a foundation of lies. He took a deep breath, straightening his posture, and walked up to the podium. The room fell silent. "I stand before you today," William began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "Ashamed, but resolute. The empire I've built was founded on deceit, manipulation, and corruption. For generations, my family has built its fortune on lies, and I have been a part of that. I have ignored the truth. I have turned a blind eye to the darkness that lies beneath the surface. But today marks the end of that chapter." There was a slight tremor in his voice, but he pushed forward, determined to complete what he had started. The media sat in stunned silence, waiting for him to continue, their pens ready to capture the monumental moment unfolding before them. "We will rebuild," William declared, his voice growing stronger. "With truth at the heart of everything we do, we will no longer hide in the shadows of our past. We will make things right no matter how long it takes, no matter the cost. The Sterling Corporation will be different from this day forward. We will be honest, transparent, and we will earn back the trust of our investors, our employees, and most importantly, the people who have been affected by the lies we've perpetuated for far too long." The room was still, the weight of his words sinking in. William's heart pounded in his chest, but there was a sense of liberation too, a sense of freedom that he hadn't felt in years. He had spoken the truth, and for the first time in a long while, it felt like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. As he finished his statement and began to turn to leave, a familiar feeling washed over him, a presence, like a silent observer watching from the shadows. He didn't have to look around to know who it was. Marcus. William couldn't see him, but he knew the boy was there, somewhere in the crowd, standing just out of view. The presence was palpable, a quiet reassurance that everything was as it should be. Marcus had warned him, had shown him the path forward, and now it was up to William to continue that journey on his own. As William made his way out of the press conference room, his steps slow and measured, he heard a soft voice, barely audible above the bustling of reporters and photographers. It was Marcus, speaking to himself, his words barely a whisper but full of meaning. "It's over. The future is yours now, Mr. Sterling," Marcus muttered, his voice carrying the weight of all that had come before. "But you have to keep fighting for it." William paused for just a moment as the words echoed in his mind. The future is yours now. Marcus had been right. The future was now in his hands, and it was up to him to write a new story. One built on integrity, honesty, and the lessons of the past. He didn't know where Marcus had gone, but when he turned to look, the boy was nowhere to be found. The crowd had begun to disperse, and the noise of the press conference faded away. William felt a strange calm wash over him. The mystery of Marcus, the boy who had somehow seen the truth long before he could, remained unsolved. But maybe that was how it was meant to be. Some mysteries, some lessons were never meant to be fully understood. As William walked away from the podium and into the unknown future, he was no longer the man who had clung to the legacy of deceit. He was a man who had made a choice, a man who had chosen to embrace the truth, no matter how painful or difficult it might be. There would be challenges ahead, obstacles to overcome, and it would take time to rebuild the trust he had lost. But for the first time in years, William felt hopeful. He had the chance to rewrite the story. And somewhere in the shadows, Marcus was watching, content with the knowledge that he had helped guide William to this moment. He had done his part, and now the future was in William's hands. The world had changed, and only time would tell if the lessons of the past would be enough to shape a brighter tomorrow. As for William, he didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in his life, he was ready to fight for it, ready to rebuild with the only thing that could truly sustain him, truth. And with that, the mysterious boy who had changed everything slipped back into the shadows, leaving behind only the impact of his warning and the hope that the future could indeed be rewritten.